Today's class tackles a hugely significant topic: how to ensure the rapidly evolving world of artificial intelligence develops in a way that fosters fair competition, drives innovation, and ultimately serves the public interest. There's a growing concern that the AI landscape is becoming increasingly concentrated, with a few dominant players potentially shaping its entire future. To guide us through these complex issues, we're thrilled to have Tejas join the show. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
All right. So, first, as always, we're going to start with the fundamentals, going through what we mean when we talk about an anti monopoly approach to AI governance, breaking down some of those key underlying legal concepts. We'll then move into how those ideas map onto the current AI ecosystem, given the current nature of the AI stack. And then finally, we'll move into some more normative questions about maybe what we want to see happen or what may happen in the relatively near future. So let's just start with a broad analysis of what we mean when we're talking about anti-monopoly principles, because I think most listeners will have heard of antitrust. They're familiar maybe with the Sherman Act. They know about the FTC. They know all these things, but anti-monopoly maybe isn't a phrase that comes readily to mind.
Yeah, sure. So I'm happy to try to provide some. Sure, I'm happy to try to provide some context there. So maybe one way to think about this is to think of antitrust as a subset of anti-monopoly law generally. So if you go back in time a little bit, and you don't have to go that far back in time, but if you go back in time a little bit, you'll see that we addressed problems of competition and concentration across the economy through a variety of ways. Sometimes we would use antitrust or ex post litigation, using antitrust and the Sherman Act, to address places where industries got too concentrated or one company gained too much power. But we also have a series of regulatory interventions designed to address problems of monopoly, maybe in sectors that we anticipate will become monopolistic, or in some cases are best constructed as monopolies. So here I'm thinking of, in particular, industries that are natural monopolies. So if you have an industry that's a natural monopoly, you want it to be served by a monopoly because that's the most efficient approach from one perspective. The problem is then you end up with a monopolist. A monopolist could do all sorts of bad things, charge you high prices, skimp on quality. And so then you have a bunch of regulatory interventions that intercede into that to say, okay, we want the monopolist, we want you to be a monopolist, but we don't want you to do a series of bad monopoly things. And so we're going to regulate. I'm happy to dive into more detail on sort of what that looks like, but that's the idea here, is that anti-monopoly is competition regulation that includes antitrust, but is not limited to antitrust.
Yeah, and I think it's really important too to just highlight the fact that this sort of anti-monopoly tradition preceded a lot of the antitrust issues that we saw culminate with, or begin with, arguably, the Sherman Act. So folks who are looking for additional homework in this regard can go read whole books on this topic. Dan Crane produced an excellent book on the anti-monopolist tradition. So there's just a rich research vein that I'm glad the two of you tapped into here. And I guess one thing that I'd love to have you zero in on in particular would be, well, first, let's just make sure we define what is a natural monopoly and what are some of the kind of hallmarks of a natural monopoly.
Yeah, so let's start with the natural monopoly idea. So, the sort of standard econometric definition for natural monopoly is this term called subadditivity. So subadditivity in math means that you have two things, you add them together, and the sum is less than your addends. In what that means for natural monopoly is that if you have two providers serving the market, that is worse than having one provider serve the market. How does that work? Here's a sort of classic example. Imagine that this is a classic but highly stylized example. Imagine that you have a market of telephone customers, and there's 1 million people spread out across city and suburbs. And let's say it costs one telephone provider $1 million to build the network. A million customers, $1 million works out to $1 a customer, right? Easy. That's a
Not
highly
bad.
stylized example. Um, Now imagine that you want to introduce competition into that market. Now, one thing to notice about this market, the telephone market, is that your fixed costs are really, really high. You have to build the network to connect everybody first, then your marginal costs are pretty low. Once you've built the network, it's essentially costless to turn on service at any one house and get someone connected to the network. So fixed costs $1 million really high, marginal costs per user costs really, really low. You introduce competition into the market, the competitor has to build their own network. The competitor is trying to reach the same million customers. So now you have a competitor also spending $1 million to build their competing network. Now you've spent $2 million to connect the same million customers. What's your average cost per customer? $2 a customer. So that's the natural monopoly construct, is that what all the costs are fixed costs, or almost all the costs are fixed costs. Average cost per customer grows as you add new competitors to the market. That's bad for consumers because now consumers end up paying more even though they have competitors, at least if they were paying at cost rates. So one of the things that I just told you is that fixed costs, economies of scale matter quite a bit to the natural monopoly construct. What are some other things that matter quite a bit? I know we're going to get to how this maps onto AI later on, but there's a really interesting report from the Rand Foundation, or the Rand Institute. It's Rand. There's a really interesting report by Rand that came out last year on evaluating natural monopoly conditions in the AI foundation model market. And one of the things that they do is they sort of step back a little bit from the technical sub-additivity model of natural monopoly, and they say, look, here are the factors that really matter. Is the good a homogeneous good? Is it like a commodity? Are there high economies of scale? Are there high network effects? Are there high economies of scope? That is, does the thing that you build have application for a number of different uses or a number of different industries? And it turns out that if you have all those things, homogeneous good, economies of scale, economies of scope, network effects, you're very likely going to see something that looks like a natural monopoly. And then once you have that natural monopoly, you have a market that's best served by only one company, one provider, and competition introduces some potentially bad effects.
Yeah, and I love this because it really gets into the weeds of how we want to structure certain markets to serve the public welfare. And in some ways, it may be counterintuitive, where, as you're pointing out, depending on the characteristics of the market, we actually want to see less competition. So good to have that in the back of our minds. But I'll let you jump in there. Did you have something
Yeah,
that
I
you?
do. So it is true, like that we want there to only be one provider because we want the cost structure to be as low as possible. However, we don't want that one provider to be entirely unregulated, because then what you end up with, right? So the thing to point out is that you could have one provider serve the million customers, build one network, and they would have a cost structure that is the most efficient. But that's just their cost structure. It's not necessarily their pricing structure. That is, they might charge prices unrestrained by competition. In fact, they are likely to charge prices unrestrained by competition. They'll offer quality of service unrestrained by competition. And so it is important to both identify those natural monopoly markets, identify the places where competition might be destructive, um, but also pair that recognition with the regulatory interventions that you need in order to make sure the monopoly provider does not engage in monopoly abuses.
Yeah, and
It's not
this.
enough to just say natural monopoly, we don't want competition. You've got to regulate.
Well, and I love this too because you and I presumably could nerd out for a very long time about the Telegraph and other historical examples of this very question, where In previous scholarship, I looked at Western Union, for example, and this very issue of quality became a real concern, where the telegraph market, like our phone market that we just discussed, had a homogeneous good, economies of scale, network effects, and yet Western Union at some point, given that they basically controlled all of the telegraph market for a little bit, just started not repairing a lot of its infrastructure. And that's obviously not a good thing for consumers and can kind of chip away at this idea of what are the circumstances or what sort of regulation do we want to see imposed on these natural monopolies. So before we get into the AI context, we're close. What should we think about when we're talking about common carriers? How does that work into this conversation when we're talking about this kind of broader anti-monopoly theory?
Yeah, so imagine now you have a telegraph provider, a telephone provider. What are the things that you might be worried they'll do um, when they have control over this natural monopoly service? Now, not all natural monopolies have this common carriage element to them, um, and not all common carriers have this natural monopoly aspect to them. And so there's a relationship here, though they're not coterminous. Um, but just to keep it sort of in the anti-monopoly vein, I think one of the things you might be worried about is if you're AT&T and you're the natural monopolist in a telephone market, you might worry that they'll say, okay, look, like we're a natural monopolist, we agree to provide service to the entire city. We will agree to your rate and service, your rate regulations and your quality regulations. But in order to make sure that we can provide adequate quality of service, one of the things that we want to make sure is that every single consumer, they only buy telephones from us, because we're worried about these garbage telephones that other people are going to build and plug into our network. They're going to ruin the network. They're going to increase our costs. Everyone's going to end up paying. And in fact, that's what AT&T did. AT&T said, look, we need to make sure that we control the market for consumer equipment. So if you want to invent a modem, if you want to invent a fax machine, if you want to invent a new type of device, well, it's got to come from AT&T. It's got to come from Bell Labs. And we're going to test it, certify it, produce it, sell it. That is what AT&T did, is it used its power over the platform, its power over the network, to leverage control into an adjacent market, the market for equipment that connects to the network. And so you might be worried about that sort of monopoly leveraging concern. And so you might, to address that concern, introduce rules that say, no, AT&T, you can't do that. You can't discriminate against the types of devices that connect to your network. You can't discriminate against the types of users that can use your network. That is, we want everybody to be able to call. We don't want you to discriminate against providers who might compete with your other businesses. We don't want you discriminating on the basis of race or gender or class. So you can imagine a series of regulations aimed at curbing the power of the network owner to discriminate against would-be users, would-be comers to the platform or service. Now, there's a similarly long tradition, which I think you alluded to, in sort of common carriers, and this goes all the way back to innkeepers, and innkeepers had to receive guests in the order they arrived, and the people who took you on a ferry across the river had to receive you in the order they arrived and charge you standard rates. So there's this tradition of sort of common carriage and non-discrimination, and that you serve all comers on equal terms, and that those rules have been incorporated into things like telephone, telegraph. And there's a long-running dispute as to the extent to which that should also be required of broadband internet service providers. That's basically the context of the net neutrality debate, which I know is what we're not here to talk about, but I could talk for that. I could talk about that for hours.
We're gonna have to have. I had full disclosure for our listeners. I've taken a course from the esteemed professor at Berkeley where we just nerded out about net neutrality for hours on end. So we will have to have you back at some point just for that conversation.
We can do that.
Well,
But that's the non-discrimination part of this.
and to bring this a little bit forward, almost into the AI space, I do want to hopefully just flesh out that you all aren't only thinking about AI. You're not only thinking about innkeepers and telephone companies and telegraph companies. Arguably, there was a sort of period where we just didn't apply a lot of these principles, and that was to social media platforms. Or how can we fit social media platforms kind of in this conversation, just to give listeners one more data point on how to think about some of these concerns?
Well, I think let me see. Do you mean from the common, just to get clarification, from a common carriage perspective, from a monopoly perspective, from
Uh, Either or, whichever. Just because in terms of this platform notion of just giving folks another sense of, all right, we're seeing a homogenous good, we're seeing economies of scale, we're seeing network effects, and yet we don't see maybe perhaps the sort of regulation we would expect, and resulting in concentration.
I see. Okay. So I think, do you want to ask the question again, and then I'll answer it.
Yeah, sure. So before we get into AI, just to give listeners one more data point in this sort of broader anti monopoly context and considerations of natural monopolies and common carriage and the underlying principles, how might we think about those key concerns and factors when discussing social media platforms? Something that arguably hasn't seen as much regulation as some people would have expected, especially with the concentrated market we see today.
Yeah. So that's an interesting question. Let's talk about social media. I think so. Sort of two related but distinct concerns, as I said before. Right. One question is it is it a natural monopoly or is it a concentrated market? And should there be common carriage rules that apply? So I think the natural monopoly question is an interesting one, and I think your listeners and viewers can decide for themselves whether or not they think Facebook and Twitter is a natural monopoly. Do they offer a homogenous good? Are there economies of scale? Are there economies of scope? Are there network effects? Those are the sorts of things to consider. The one thing I want to say is that a natural monopoly doesn't mean that there will be only one provider. You can have, right? You could have a city of 1 million people with two telephone networks in it. The natural monopoly only means that the market is most efficiently served by one provider, but you could have an inefficient construct. So whether or not the fact that both Twitter and Facebook exist is not dispositive of the fact that the market is not a natural monopoly. It just might be an inefficiently served market. But I'll let your viewers decide for themselves whether or not they think social media is itself a natural monopoly. As to whether or not it's a highly concentrated industry, I mean, I think we're starting to see a number of antitrust cases. Certainly, there's the pending case against Meta on whether or not there is monopoly and monopolization in the space. And then you can sort of walk down the antitrust remedies on common carriage. So this is an interesting question, and I think we're starting to see some push and pull on this. So we recently had the net choice cases on Texas and Florida's social media regulation, and those rules, no matter what you think of them, are one type of common carriage regulation. That is what Texas and Florida were trying to do. As they said, like, look, we think that these platforms are discriminating. And what we don't want them to do is discriminate. We think they're discriminating on the basis of political content, and we don't want them to discriminate. Now, I think that these questions of common carriage get really complicated when they intersect with the First Amendment, and we've seen that throughout history. So we've had sort of similar common carriage type rules that have applied to cable companies and to telephone companies, and we've had similar First Amendment challenges. The cable company said we should get to decide what channels we put on our cable service. That's our First Amendment right. Similarly, Twitter and Facebook said, look, we should get to decide what types of posts we transmit over our social media networks. That's our First Amendment editorial discretion. And we're going to see how these cases shake out ultimately. I think the Supreme Court in its net choice case, depending on how you read it, certainly put a thumb on the scale, I think, in favor of the First Amendment interests of Facebook and Twitter. But I think you are starting to see some sense that perhaps there should be less editorial discretion and more common carriage like rules, non-discrimination like rules for social media, at least from some sides of the ideological divide.
Yeah, and I think that's an important thread to pull out because we're seeing, as you noted, a sort of revival of this common carriage notion and considerations in some of these emerging markets and technology driven markets. And we're also getting a broader appreciation for the historical anti monopoly tradition being revived by various actors, various scholars, which is all teeing us up for this really important regulatory question around AI. And something that I think you and Ganesh do really well is actually add a layer of nuance. And in particular, I guess I can say 4 layers of nuance to the AI debate that usually don't get discussed. And so let's just start off with defining what is the AI stack? Because most of the time people talk about AI regulation, it just gets there's a shortcut to just, oh, we're only talking about OpenAI or we're only talking about Anthropic, but you all go 4 layers deep. So what are the layers in the AI stack that are relevant to this potential application of anti-monopoly concerns to this market?
Yeah, so I think one way to think of the stack that we talk about here is basically the supply chain. What does it take? What does it take to get to a chatbot? So the chatbot is the application, the thing that you and I interact with, ChatGPT. When we're interacting with an AI application, we're interacting with what we call the application layer. This is the top layer, the consumer-facing layer. Uh, but it turns out, and whenever I talk about competition and AI, I often immediately get the objection: "What are you talking about? Like everybody and their brother is building a new AI application. There's no competition issue. There are a million of these." And it is true that there are a lot of AI applications. There are new chatbots and legal drafting tools, and like education things, and this thing and that thing. There's a ton of AI applications, but when you just start to look below the stack and what it takes to build the chatbot, you'll quickly start to see competition issues. So below the application layer is what we call, and before I dive into the 4 layers, I think the one thing that I just want to caveat is that there are many ways to slice this supply chain, and Ganesh and I have picked one way to do this. We think it's a simple way, it's an easily understandable way, but there are sub layers within these layers, and there are different ways that you could rejigger them. And I just want to acknowledge that.
It's kind of
But
like
okay,
my
below the
7 layer dip. You can choose which
sure.
layers you're going to get into, layers upon layers. But I think for folks who are just trying to get that intro sense, leaning on y'all's 4 layers is really valuable here.
Yeah. So below the application layer is the model layer. So this is ChatGPT is built on GPT, right? This is OpenAI's big innovation. They've built a large language model, and they built several large language models. But it's that model that's the next layer. Then you could have an image generation model, a text model, all sorts of different video models for Sora, or models for robotics, for mimicking human movement. All kinds of different models that the apps interact with in order to create the application. That is, when ChatGPT generates text, it does so on the basis of the data and the statistics that are in the model. To create models, to generate models, you need a lot of computational power. That computational power is typically housed in cloud computing infrastructure. So you have three major cloud computing platforms: AWS, Google Cloud, and Microsoft Azure. And to build that cloud computing infrastructure, you need computational hardware, primarily microprocessing hardware, GPUs, chips. So those are the four layers: the applications, the models, the cloud, and the hardware.
And
Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, so as you noted, that third layer, when we're thinking about the cloud computing layer, we only have three major actors there. Again, AWS, Google, and Microsoft. With respect to that fourth layer, we also see a severe shortage of actors in that space. We're usually just thinking about NVIDIA and TSMC. And so, looking back at our earlier conversations where we were flagging some instances where, hey, maybe we're not seeing a ton of competition in this space, starts to prompt us to ask, okay, are we in natural monopoly land? Are we in an area that warrants kind of the application of some of these prior traditions to ensure the market's serving the public interest? So, how do you think about the application of those principles to these various layers?
Yeah. Yes, great question. Let's talk about them layer by layer.
Let's do it.
Uh, and let's start with the model. So applications. You know what? Let's do it. Excuse me. Let's do it layer by layer, and let's start at the bottom. So let's start with chips. There are, like you said, just a couple of companies here. There's NVIDIA, there's TSMC. TSMC dominates manufacturing of microprocessing hardware. NVIDIA dominates design of chips. That's it. I mean, so this is a highly concentrated industry. Whether it is necessarily a natural monopoly or not, I think, I think you need to do a little bit more industry analysis. I think to get a sense of, what are the fixed costs, the economies of scope, economies of scale, network effects, maybe not. But regardless of whether or not it is truly a natural monopoly, this is a highly concentrated industry, and so you might either want to introduce competition if you think it's not a natural monopoly, and think of ways to introduce competition like subsidizing new manufacturing capacity, or you would want to regulate the monopolist as a natural monopoly. And those are your legislative options, your regulatory options. Moving up to cloud, again, a highly concentrated industry, a market dominated by three players. So again, you want to decide. So what are the approaches you want to do? Do you want to regulate these entities as monopolists, or do you want to try to find a way to introduce more competition? Introducing competition is going to be difficult because, again, the fixed costs, the barriers to entering this market are quite high. You have to build a massive distributed infrastructure of computational hardware, expensive computational hardware. And it's not just the hardware, it's the data centers. It's not just the data centers, it's the buildings, it's the power, it's the cooling. When you think of what it takes to actually build one of these things, you're talking about hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars to build this entire infrastructure. And there are lots of elements that go into, these things are so massive, these data centers, that they are often strategically located close to power plants in order to take advantage of lower electricity costs. That's how much power they consume. That's how expensive they are. That's the scale of them.
And just that
Okay,
point
so then,
alone, I think is so valuable to point out because it already invokes the earlier conversation we had of just thinking about our highly stylized model that you suggested of just thinking about a telephone company and all of the money it costs to build out that network, $1 million to serve this one community. Orders of magnitude greater for these data centers and the complexity, not only with respect to all of those inputs, but now to make things even more complicated, what we're seeing play out right now at the state level and federal level, all of the permitting concerns, all of the state law concerns and federal regulatory concerns make inserting that competition all the more harder. So it's just compounding issues with respect to creating that sort of competition.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's the introducing competition, particularly into these infrastructural layers, and this is true not just of data centers and cloud computing infrastructure, though it is true of that, but also of many physical networked industries. This has been a long running concern. Can you efficiently introduce competition, and if not, what should you do about it? And I think we will soon see more and more questions of that sort about cloud computing because we haven't really addressed that concern yet. It's sort of this cloud computing infrastructure has become a part of our internet infrastructure in a way that we haven't really paid attention to. But it's distinct from the old internet networks. It adds new capabilities, raises new concerns, and has so far escaped policy scrutiny. But I think that, at least I hope, that's coming to an end.
And let's save
Okay,
that
so
for
let's move
our
up.
final analysis. But yeah, let's move up to our next layer. So we're moving through our 4-layer dip
So we
onto
did chips, we did cloud computing infrastructure. Now let's do models. So the reason I mentioned this RAND report earlier, the RAND report is titled "Evaluating Natural Monopoly Conditions in the AI Foundation Model Market." But what the report sort of comes out and says, like, so look at the criteria: homogeneous good. Is this true for foundation models? Yes. Economies of scale? Yes. Network effects? Yes. Economies of scope? Yes. What's the case for a natural monopoly? It's strong. And I'll tell you, not to pat myself on the back too much, but 2 years before this RAND report comes out, I wrote another piece. It was in the Iowa Law Review, titled "Machine Learning as Natural Monopoly," and it basically
I'll
tries
give
to
you a
use
pat on the
machine
back. I'm sorry we didn't have you on the Lawfare podcast or Scaling Laws back then to make sure that got the attention it deserved. But we'll give you kudos now.
Yeah. So machine learning as natural monopoly. Basically, there I make the same argument that developing foundation models is like natural monopoly. It looks like a natural monopoly market, and so we should consider natural monopoly style regulation. So I think there may be some forward-looking concerns. Do we think that this will continue to be a natural monopoly looking forward? Will scaling change? Do the economies of scale change? Will the fixed cost structure change? Does DeepSeek really upset this? My own opinion is not really. I don't think that it's really going to change that much, at least in the short to medium term.
And
And that
can
this
you describe
natural
why?
monopoly.
What's kind of undergirding that conclusion?
Yeah, I think with regard to DeepSeek in particular, the thing that DeepSeek does is it, at least, okay, let me see. So at least with DeepSeek in particular, one thing that we learned about DeepSeek is that it itself was trained on the outputs of GPT, which suggests that you need that sort of prior large investment to create any downstream derivative competition, which is maybe just the sort of thing that we were worried about before, that you can have competition, but there are concerns about whether or not that competition is destructive or is the sort of competition that is bad for the natural monopoly market. So I think, at least in the short to medium term, we're going to continue to see these natural monopoly conditions hold in the model context. So we have highly concentrated chips, highly concentrated cloud computing infrastructure, natural monopoly criteria satisfied for models, and then applications. And applications, sure, lots and lots of people are trying to develop applications. But the concern, just like the concern in the context of the telephone and the telegraph, is that the proprietors of the lower layers in the supply chain, the necessary inputs to the applications, will be able to take control in a way that drives or alters the direction of application level innovation. OpenAI could decide tomorrow to build its own application that competes with your new chatbot, your cool education, teach kids how to learn math application. They could build their own. They could affect your price per token, the cost that you pay to build your application. They have a deal with Microsoft for access to Azure. Microsoft could affect how much anybody else pays to build a new model on Azure. So that control at the lower layers can filter upstream and affect the direction, type, the players, could basically lead to more concerns of leveraging and discrimination at the application layer. So even if you see today robust competition in the application layer, you should worry about the concentration in the lower layers and how that might affect application development, innovation over the long run.
And this is why it's so concerning that conversations about the AI stack aren't occurring more frequently. We have thousands of bills pending before state legislatures and Congress right now, and yet consideration of this AI stack, in my opinion, just isn't something that folks are talking enough about because, as you're pointing out, you have to dig deep to each layer of the stack to understand what are the policy ramifications and how's that going to change the future trajectory of AI. So you two conclude that we're kind of operating in a sort of AI oligopoly right now. Can you flesh that out a little bit more about why you go so far as to label this as a sort of oligopoly?
I mean, sure, I'm happy to, but I think, at least I hope that the prior description of the stack sort of gets you right there. Look, who are the companies? Anthropic, which is closely tied to Amazon, which owns AWS. Okay, there's OpenAI, closely tied to Microsoft, which runs Azure. So the same few names pop up again and again when you look at cloud, when you look at the models, when you look at the leading applications. And so there's just a few companies, and they're the companies that you might guess in the technology space. These big technology companies that have the requisite investments and power at various layers in the stack are likely to, without, I think, some sort of intervention or regulation, are likely to control the direction of AI application innovation going forward. And I don't just, and actually AI application and AI innovation going forward. So not just application level innovation, but also innovation when it comes to cloud infrastructure, also model innovation, also chip design, right? All of the innovation at all layers of the stack is controlled by a really narrow set of companies. And I think experience has shown us that, we are most innovative, most dynamic um, when we have good, robust competition, or at least when we don't have old, stodgy monopolists that are taking what's the phrase I'm looking for? That are taking advantage of consumers.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note this sort of distinguishing factor between sustaining innovation and disruptive innovation, where we may see these handful of companies continue to innovate on the margins, right? They may continue to develop the next best LLM. They may continue to come out with some new tools and some new exciting features. But in terms of that disruptive innovation, the sort of innovation that creates new markets, that creates new companies, that leads to that sort of dynamic churn that we're always looking for, a productive churn, that requires the robust competition you're talking about, at least when we look at economic analysis and economic history. So that leaves us in a kind of difficult spot. If we've got this AI oligopoly, what next? What should we be doing? We walk through how it's really hard to create the sort of competition we want to see at the deeper layers. We also know that it's not just the easiest thing to spin up a new OpenAI or spin up a new Anthropic. So what gives? What should we do if we want to see more competition and more innovation in this space?
Yeah. So I've yes. So I have, I think, alluded to a number of the regulatory solutions, and I don't want to be here too super prescriptive about here's exactly what you should do about chips and here's exactly what you should do about cloud. But I do think, the same set of things that we have, the same set of regulations that we've used in history will be useful and instructive in this AI context. So, what are some of the things that we've done in the past? Um, so in the past, we have offered subsidies, right? Subsidies to new entrants in markets that we think can sustain competition but have high barriers to entry or high fixed costs. And that is something that I think we tried to do with the CHIPS Act. So the CHIPS Act was one act enacted during the Biden administration that gave a ton of money to try to develop new semiconductor and microprocessing hardware manufacturing capacity in the United States. That's great. We should have more manufacturing capacity. We should not be so reliant on a single bottleneck for microprocessing hardware. I think we saw the effects of that in COVID. When during COVID, when manufacturing slowed down, all of a sudden there was a big chip crunch, which led to manufacturing constraints and higher prices. There's a contributing factor. And so I think subsidizing more capacity is a great idea. I think we'll see whether or not, the CHIPS Act funding gets carried all the way through in this administration. But that's one approach. Subsidize new capacity in some of these markets. Earlier, we talked about common carriage rules and non-discrimination rules and things like net neutrality. You might imagine that we have similar non-discrimination rules for model owners to make sure they don't advantage their own applications and squeeze out your competing application. Or the same non-discrimination rules for cloud computing infrastructure to make sure that anybody, not just Microsoft's favorite players or Amazon's favorite players, can use the infrastructure to develop new models or develop new computationally based innovations. I think one other thing that we're starting to see in cloud computing, or not starting to see, one other thing that we've seen for some time in cloud computing, but are only starting to pay attention to, are the switching costs. It turns out that it's really, really hard to move off of a cloud platform once you've started to build on it. It's hard to switch from Azure to Google Cloud to AWS to some even smaller provider that may be trying to start up. And so one question is, how do we smooth interoperability across cloud computing providers? And some competition authorities outside the US, the UK in particular, are really starting to look at switching costs and competition concerns in cloud computing. Those are some of the major ideas, sort of aside from straightforward antitrust enforcement, and there's other things that I talked about. If you have a natural monopoly or a monopolist, then you should think about maybe rate regulation, and you could consider things like rate regulation and quality regulation. If you're worried about models being natural monopolists, and you're worried that a model that's a natural monopolist is going to face limited competition, because of that limited competition, maybe is not super concerned about the quality, is not super concerned about addressing problems of bias or discrimination, or is going to charge really high per token costs, or is going to charge really high data costs. Look, you want to use our model? We're going to take all the data back in and ingest it and retrain on it. And that's just the price of doing business with us because we're the only model in town. You could imagine regulations that regulate the prices you pay, both in terms of dollars and data, and that quality audits to make sure that the models are not super biased, they're not super discriminatory. This I think is particularly important for models that maybe have medical applications. You may be worried about biases and discrimination in diagnosis or treatment plans and how those things get developed. So those are that's the set of rules and regulations and policy approaches that you might apply. But again, because some of this is it's sector specific. Is this healthcare? Is this video? Is this text? I don't want to. I don't want to. I'm not sure we have the time to get into the nitty gritty details, but that's the menu. And then I think you have to look at the context and look at the menu and find the matches.
That is a impressive menu. In fact, we might even go so far as to call it a buffet of options to investigate. And I want to respect your time and the time of our listeners. So before we let you get to that buffet and continue on your important research in this field, are there any other final statements that you want to leave with our students, aka listeners? What things are you looking at, or what trends are you following that other folks may want to do the same?
I think it's really important. So I guess a couple things. One, it's important to understand the technology. Uh, so if what you want to do is regulate, if what you want to do is address concerns related to AI, it's important to understand how AI works and to understand that underlying stack, that underlying supply chain. So understanding the technology is really, really important. Um, and with that understanding of the technology and that recognition of the stack and the supply chain, I think those competition issues are really striking. Uh, but they are really, I think, underappreciated in policy circles still today. Uh, so take a look at them.
There we go. Well, accepted here and challenge accepted hopefully by our listeners. We'll have to leave it there, but thank you again for coming on to Scaling Laws.